Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows homes, so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews, all on the app. Download today.
Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to Real Estate, Real and Unscripted with Nicole. I'm Nicole Miller, your host, and I am so excited you've joined me for another episode. Today, we are going to delve into the world of guardianship with two amazing attorneys that I know that are board-certified elder law attorneys that are focused in the guardianship world, Jill Ginsburg and Michelle Hollister. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining us. I appreciate you being here, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say and share to educate everybody out there. So I'm going to take a moment to let them each introduce themselves, and then we'll dig into some of the questions. Jill, go ahead. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for allowing me to be here today, Nicole. I am a board-certified elder law attorney in the state of Florida. I practice guardianship, trust administration, probate administration, and estate administration. And I am active in many arts institutions such as museums and up-and-coming artists.
Amazing.
Take it away, Michelle.
What brought you into the world of elder law? Did you practice any other law before? Did you fall into this later, or was that kind of from the get-go?
A fantastic question. I am also an estate planning attorney, although doing a lot less of that. And in my estate planning days, one of my clients, and that was about 20 years ago, one of my clients' financial advisors came to me and said, Jill, there's $70,000 a day flying out of her account to the Jamaican lottery.
Okay.
He's incapacitated. There's no durable power of attorney, and we don't know what to do. We need to do something. And a guardianship be had, and I was hooked.
Wow.
So
amazing. Thank you. Michelle, let us know a little bit about yourself and what brought you into this field as well.
Me too, a board-certified elder law attorney. My practice is very similar to Jill's, and we've actually had the opportunity to work together many times, so that's pretty nice as well. I started and fell into all of this because my first job out of law school was, they called them staff attorneys, but I was basically a law clerk in Broward County, and that for the probate division. And that's where, I met my mentor, Judge Mel Grossman, and I learned about probate, guardianship, mental health issues, and the importance of advocating for such a vulnerable population. And in terms of guardianship, I was fortunate enough to get on the radar of Governor Bush, and I was appointed to run what was then called the statewide public guardianship office. And I served for Governors Bush and Governor Chris. So
amazing.
I've been very fortunate in that respect. So and one of the things that's nice, when you told me that Jill and I would be doing this together, is our area of the law is so collegial. Like, there's nobody I can't even think of anybody. You couldn't pick up the phone and say, hey, what would you do? Or, just run things by and just work well together. So I don't want to speak for Jill, but I think we're blessed that we do what we do.
I can say that's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. And I think the fact that you do what you do because of what you do makes it that way. I feel like the people who are in that space, like, you're doing good for people, right? You're in a role that's, fixing major issues and taking care of our population that's vulnerable. So I feel like that kind of makes sense in that type of space. So that's awesome. Yeah, when I met you both and I knew you both knew each other, I'm like, small world, look at that. I figured I'd have you both on here. And honestly, over my years, I feel like it's been hard to find attorneys that do practice guardianship, just from my experience. A lot of people I've seen elder law, estate planning, Medicaid planning, but like I have not had like a plethora of attorneys that are doing that. So definitely it's just a small space. And so awesome. You guys are wonderful. And I'm glad to have you both here. So guardianship, what does that mean, right? For people out there, what is guardianship? Why is someone being put in a position where they're going to need to be in guardianship? If we can kind of give a background about the process and a little bit more information, just to give the viewers out there exactly what that looks like. One of you want to take that first, whichever wants to go first.
You want to take it, Jill?
Oh, goody. What is guardianship? Guardianship is the process of, and there's actually many types of guardianship, but the guardianship that we're really talking about is an elder guardianship. And in an elder guardianship, it's the process of putting somebody, declaring them incapacitated, and then having somebody appointed to take care of them. Now, why would you need a guardianship? Generally, and you hope, and this is why Michelle and I'm sure, yell at people, get your documents done. Why? What is a document? A durable power of attorney, a healthcare surrogate, a living will. I don't care what you do to your beneficiaries. Leave them whatever you want. But these are the three most important documents that you must have. These documents allow people to act on your behalf when you can't. And if you don't have these documents and people can't act on your behalf, that is when you're in a guardianship.
Yeah, it's true. And I would add to that, everybody over 18 needs to have these documents. People don't realize that once, your kids, your loved ones, they turn 18, there is nobody with legal authority, a hospital, a bank. They could, and they would be within their right to say to a parent, I'm not talking to you. Yeah. And in an emergency situation, that would be frightening for a parent. So I would imagine, in the month of August, before kids are getting ready to leave for college, my office is more college students, kids getting ready to go, because parents are educating themselves and learning. I better be prepared for an emergency.
That's a very good point, because we think of things like that as you get older. Your documents, your will, all of that. And I feel like that part of it is missed. People don't realize that, oh my God, until you get to that point where they're in the hospital, God forbid. And I've had stories where I've heard that, where they're like, I couldn't do anything. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, right? So I think for viewers out there, realizing the importance of just getting everything situated. I think a lot of times often people don't think about it. They don't want to plan for the worst, or they think things are too expensive. But one thing I could say for certain is that the alternative is absurdly expensive and way worse. So, definitely, get yourself a trusted attorney that can get all those ducks in a row for you. And one other thing too that comes to mind is, and you guys could tell me, every state has different requirements and documents. So you could have a power of attorney from another state, where in Florida has to have 2 witnesses, right? And you come from another state. I've had in my career real estate powers of attorney that came that they filled out off of an online website, and they didn't have it witnessed and notarized, and or they had one witness and it wasn't notarized, or it was done by an attorney in another state, where in that state they have less requirements, and then it doesn't translate here. So you're going to try to sell that property for them here with a power of attorney that's not considered, whatever within our state. So can you speak a little bit about that? And, people, especially Florida, they move from other states. People retire here. You have, all your stuff situated before you come here. What are some things that need to be reviewed more regularly, rechecked? And what are things that need to be reevaluated when you are moving into different states? If you want to go ahead, Michelle, I'll give that to you.
So let's be clear that the United States Constitution actually does say that anything that's valid in one state, if it was done validly in state A, it's to be valid, it's to be honored by every other state. Okay? That's what the law says. The reality, though, and I think what you find as a realtor is with title companies
Right.
and getting sales approved, is that if anybody is looking at a document and it's not what they're used to looking at, then people are given a hard time. Things are rejected in an emergency situation. Maybe they're told it's not valid when it actually is. And so there's a difference between in this niche area, there's a difference between what the law says and what being practical. And so and I'm sure, Jill probably does the same thing with her snowbird clients. Technically, do they need two sets of powers of attorney and healthcare surrogate and living wills? No. Should they? Because they don't want to be in an emergency situation and have a hard time? Absolutely. So, it's a strange area to operate in. But if you want to avoid any potential issues and crisis, then the documents should be state specific, but they don't have to be.
I'm actually going to tack on to Michelle because the Florida Durable Power of Attorney really should be state specific. Nicole, I know you've dealt with them, and Michelle obviously has. We have a very, very specific state statute. A lot of the banks do not like dealing with any other powers of attorney, just like Michelle said. And I hate to say it to, my clients, but the second you come in this state, please redo your documents. Because even though you might have valid documents in another state, this is Florida. Florida is a whole different story. We do things way differently down here.
Yeah, and I think I've seen I've seen both things, right? I've had powers of attorney that were printed off the internet, and that's one thing I will tell you guys out there in the world of listening to this podcast. Please hire an attorney to do these documents for you. Please, because at the end of the day, there's also a lot more things like in their planning purposes, Medicaid planning and things like that can be put in these powers of attorney, that I've been shared with that help you with certain aspects that you don't think of. Even, if you're going to be selling a property and your name is on it with the person, there's self-serving type of things. I'm not giving advice out there, but there's a lot of things that you don't think of. And then you get to that point and you're stuck. So you have a power of attorney also that sometimes I'll see them. And this is just me saying from what, the title companies and the attorneys have seen. They'll look at the power of attorney when I take a listing and they'll say, yeah, it doesn't say anything about selling or conveying property. Okay, well, they're trying to sell the house. So it doesn't say, there's nothing in it that says anything allowing them to sell or convey property. And they didn't realize that, whatever form they filled out didn't cover every basic, every point that possibly could come up. And then when you have that point that does come up, then you're stuck. And then what happens, for example, in those cases, and that's kind of a segue into guardianship, you have this power of attorney that is not valid for whatever reason, or I've had several that weren't even signed, that things were missing, pages were missing, like really funky stuff. And I've had them as well where they thought they had the power of attorney, and it was not valid. It didn't allow for, it was valid for whatever other reasons, but it had nothing about selling property. And then in that case, couldn't be used to sell this house. And we had, an example, like Jill had helped me. We had two people who had very, very far gone dementia at that point. And now we're in a situation like what happens, right? So if your ducks are not in a row and then you get to that point, if you don't have a power of attorney, you can't do anything. If you had the proper power of attorney, you can, but what happens when you don't? So, segueing into, guardianship, how do you avoid guardianship and how do you find yourself in guardianship? Some examples and things like that. Go ahead, Jill.
I think you find yourself in a guardianship when you, in 80% of the cases, and I think Michelle will agree with me, you didn't do the right thing. Okay, somebody just didn't do the right thing. 20% of the cases, sometimes, and Michelle and I both know this, you'll have a full set of documents, but you're still going to have a guardianship somehow because the documents don't work. Avoiding to avoid a guardianship, really get the documents done. Make sure they're done according to Florida law. If you move into the state, don't try and be cheap. As you said, don't pull them off the internet. I've seen more mistakes from that. Michelle and I make lots of money because people pull stuff off the internet. It's terrible. I lecture, even though I'm a guardianship attorney, the one thing you don't want is a guardianship. It is a very expensive proposition. It is hourly, it is litigation. You don't understand. Everybody gets a lawyer. The person who's incapacitated gets a lawyer. The person who's moving gets a lawyer. Then if the court doesn't like what's going on, they appoint a lawyer. Then the other kids come in or the other people come in. And there's constant hearings. There's court reporters. It is just, and then you're asking a judge. And this is what I like to tell people. Well, what do you think, Miss Ginsburg? I'm like, not up to me, up to him or her. You are dependent on somebody. If they had a good day that morning, terrific. If they didn't, well, then you're probably not getting what you want. If you can control your own destiny, and I'm kind of one of those people that likes to make sure that I get what I want, I would much rather have a durable power of attorney, a healthcare surrogate, a living will that's going to tell people this is who's supposed to take care of me. This is exactly, and my living will says exactly what I want. It's very detailed. So there's no question about what I want. Because if there's a question, that's when the guardianship ensues. And the problem is that even if you have good documents, but your kids are fighting over them, that's also when a guardianship ensues. And I'm sure Michelle can elaborate on that.
Well, and I would add, the importance of updating the documents. So I'm seeing that, people are living longer, right? And modern medicine and all these things, and people do the documents, they put them on a shelf, and they didn't think about they're outliving the people they named in
documents.
The Yep. So every once in a while, you gotta pull them off the shelf and make sure that that you didn't choose somebody when you lived in a different state, 40 years ago, that you don't even know where they are anymore, which happens. But it is so easily avoidable in the majority of situations. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but it is avoidable. And like Jill said, the cost and expense, a few $100s to do forms, or what can be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Jill and I have both been involved in cases where it is hundreds of thousands of dollars. The only winners are the lawyers.
And it's not just money. It's time, aggravation, frustration. One example I use is probate. I do a ton of probate listings. And I have one now that probably tops the cake of all probates that have existed, literally. And it took a year and a half. You have to hire PIs. We had 5 actual probates from one property going back to deeds that were done improperly. It's been a mess, a complete mess. And instead, and even if, those are crazy cases, but when you put yourself in a position where you don't have the proper docs, and we kind of segued real quick to probate, but you put yourself in a position where you don't have the proper docs, you're causing your family to have to, they're helping you. Maybe you're having a lot of home care and there's a lot of stress involved in taking care of all of that. On top of it, you're dealing with the stress of the paperwork, and then you're dealing with the stress of family members fighting, and that doesn't need to happen, right? So, in the lens of even probate and all of that, I usually tell clients, get your ducks, the whole package of ducks in a row, because you don't want your children, like, if God forbid you pass, like, they should be, mourning you and going through that process, not dealing with all this other nonsense that is going to cost them a ton, but is also going to strain the family. It's going to strain the relationships. It gets ugly. So it's so important. Yeah, definitely. So can anyone become a guardian? Is there training, education involved? In the cases that you guys have, I know, you have guardian where a family member might be a guardian, where someone outside is a guardian. So speak to a little bit about what that looks like in terms of, if you have a case, if you want to use an example, if someone comes, they need a guardian, they have a daughter, they don't, someone wants to be the guardian. What are different ways in which guardianship can kind of practically come to life? Who can be a guardian? Is there training involved?
I can't say anyone could be a guardian. Basically, the people who are guardians are usually family members or a professional guardian, which I'll get into in the first place. If you have a felony, you cannot serve as a guardian. If you think you had a felony, if you might have had a felony, I love these people. You ask them, well, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Well, it was like 15 years ago. I had something and I'm not really sure. Well, you got to be sure, because guess what? The court is going to find that.
Yes.
And what we tell people is, I don't care if you had something 20 years ago, let me know so I can tell the court and they can make a determination. Because if you don't tell me, they're going to find it and you're not going to be the guardian. Also kind of frowned upon, not a black line, but a gray line, is a bankruptcy within the last 5 years. Courts do kind of frown on that a little bit.
That makes sense.
Doesn't really help people. You will have to submit to a credit check. You will have to submit to a fingerprinting, a background check. And this is anybody who serves, and this can be a family member or a relative or a neighbor or a friend. I've had all of those people serving. And if those people can't serve, as Michelle and I both know, there are people, and I represent a few, Michelle does, called professional guardians. These are people who are registered with the state. There's a lot of bad press about professional guardians. 95% of them are amazing. It is a horrible job. It is a thankless job, and we are very grateful that we have these people to do that. They don't make a lot of money, and they have a lot of aggravation. Those people are licensed a little bit differently than a family guardian would be. There is annual reporting for everybody, and a family member or somebody who is not a professional guardian must take an 8-hour course in guardianship and file that with the court. And yes, the court checks. So that's, I don't know, Michelle, if you want to add some.
Would just add, with professional guardians, their training is more robust, and they have continuing education requirements. There's bonding requirements that the state monitors. And yeah, I can't echo enough what Jill said about how thankless it is to be a professional guardian. Nobody is retiring rich off of being a professional guardian. It's a 24/7 job, and it is pretty thankless many times. And the people who do it tend to be very special, because you really need to want to help people that you're not obligated to because of blood.
Yeah.
It's a big job. So yeah, and even for family members who become guardians. The only other thing I would add when we talk about professional versus family is, people tend to think, a common scenario, and Julia and I had this pretty much exact case, where siblings, they're both, fighting to prove mom loved me more. And, they both want to be the guardian. The vast majority of time in those situations, the court will say, I'm not appointing either of you, and I'm appointing a professional. Now, Jill and I happen to luck out. We got the case where the judge actually did allow for the brothers to both serve.
Yep.
And it really is it's a challenge in those situations.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Michelle and I are very lucky that we get along with each other. We had a beautiful relationship. We really did.
Difficult case.
This was a difficult case. And that's what helps also. Now, again, Michelle and I got along very well. You have another lawyer on this case who is like this and doesn't necessarily get it or doesn't always practice in this area. And that's another reason why guardianship can go off the rails.
So kind of off the cuff, speaking about that, when someone is looking for an attorney in this field, what are some things they should be looking for? What are some, not red flags, but like what should the consumer be looking for? Because obviously not everyone's made equally. Not everyone has the same training and board certified versus not. Like, what are some of the things you would recommend for anyone anywhere listening to this when they're interviewing or considering attorneys?
Definitely looking at the board certification. It makes a huge difference. Most of the attorneys who I litigate against are board certified. I would say 90% of them are within board certified, either elder law or in the wills, trust, and estates area. it's somebody who has obviously been practicing and knows this area. Make sure they have guardianship on their website, because somebody who doesn't have this area and just tells you they're going to do it. I can't tell you how many times Michelle and I have had to clean up other guardianships. That I have a bunch of them right now where the people keep saying to me, I don't know why my former lawyer never told me this. Well, because you hired somebody who didn't have the proper credentials. The proper credentials are there. People who are practicing in the guardianship area, who are elder law attorneys, who are board certified, and who are practicing in that particular district or area. Somebody in Broward, Miami-Dade, or Palm Beach, they will know those courts fairly in and out. They will know the judges. That is also very important. You have to know your judge. You have to know their requirements. Every judge has their own requirements. Every court has their own requirements.
Yeah.
And you want the person who you're hiring to know all of that. So that's very important.
Is an excellent point about, making sure you don't want a Miami lawyer who doesn't do cases in Palm Beach County, your guardianship being their first Palm Beach County case, because they may be extremely well versed in what goes on in Dade, but Dade's a completely different world than Palm Beach, as is Broward from both of them. So having that experience being in that locale is really key, because things do differ, not just from county to county, but courtroom to courtroom. And you want somebody who knows.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wasn't thinking of that. So yeah, I think also specializing and having the years of experience in that type of field. I feel like a lot of times, and even in real estate, a lot of people like to try everything and dabble. So you'll go on someone's site and they do real estate closings and personal injury and probate. And I mean, I've had several of those. I've done hundreds of deals, and I've had several of those where literally the probate attorney does real estate full time. And I am knocking on their door. I'm like, hello, I'm looking at the docket. Like, nothing's happened in months. Where is this? Where is that? And they don't answer. And they're like, oh, and they didn't admit to the client that they dropped the ball. They literally dropped the ball and ignored emails for weeks. And so I think a lot of times people have to, they get information, and maybe you get a referral. If you get a referral and that person worked with that person, you can get a really good feel and know that they had a good experience, but it may not, right? So it also depends on who the referral source is too. So I think, take that sometimes with a grain of salt. I could tell you over my years, I've had a few this year alone that were like, they came as a referral. Horrific experience, horrific. So, you kind of have to do your due diligence and look into that. And I can't say more about how important it is when you work with someone who kind of really focuses on something, because you can't just be like a generalist in some of these professions. I think it's very important. Thank you. So just some examples, what does one do if you see a loved one making, poor decisions? What do you do when you start seeing potential concerns? And obviously it's very hard with mom starting to show diminished capacity, and like how do you approach that, or any advice you can give, because you might be faced with someone saying no, there's nothing wrong with me, right? So you can't Baker Act something, right? So it gets to the point where you have to force that upon them, right? But what happens in the beginning where you have, you're seeing mom starting to diminish, and then if it gets too far along, then it's too late, right? So you can't get those ducks in a row. So what do you recommend to people out there when they're seeing that family member? And it's kind of a hard place to be in. I know a lot of people are in it.
Run to the lawyers. That's that's what first of all, run. Try and get to, if your parents already had a lawyer, try and take them already to their lawyer that they already had. If they didn't, you're going to have to make that decision, which isn't always great, but you're going to have to make it, and take them into an independent lawyer. And that independent lawyer is going to make the decision whether they can draft documents or they can't.
What do you face? So I'll interrupt that real quick because I just thought of something. So what happens if you're in a position, because this did happen in a case that I was with, where the parent does not want to listen, does not want to admit they have a problem, and then cuts the entire world off and does not want to deal with their children. And then the children pop back in the picture because someone reported them to for elder abuse. So. And we had a situation like that, which is how it kind of all came about. Like the parent didn't want to. Like, where does it become a point where like you are forcing this guardianship situation upon them? Like that was a tough one too, right? So both of you guys could take that one, but just kind of segue to that as well.
It's a great question. And I know Michelle and I get this one all the time. When does it segue? It segues when it is getting out of control. The reason why you're getting a guardianship is to show the court that this person's not taken care of and that they're not able to take care of them or their finances, depending on the situation. When it gets to the point where you see that your parent is not able to take care, and yes, sometimes DCF's going to step in. You're not going to have a choice. And it's almost better that DCF steps in, because one of the things to file a guardianship is you must call DCF generally before the guardianship is started.
Oh, okay.
So if DCF is called, you're in a much better position. Now, does it make you look bad? No, because just because you weren't there and your parent made this decision, that's not really your fault. However, once you're notified and once you know that your parent is going downhill, generally that's really the time that you're going to have to file for guardianship, and you're not going to have a choice. Is your parent going to fight you? Yes. Yeah. Is your parent going to hate you? Yes. From experience, I'm going to tell you it is awful. They're not going to be happy about it. Maybe in one situation, but the majority, they don't want it. But you're not going to have a choice. They're not going to be able to take care of themselves, and they're going to be subject to exploitation and other people moving in. That's really when you need to put an end to it.
And what I explain to families, because, they're embarrassed and they think that, this is just so unheard of. And I explain to them, this situation is your first go at it, your first rodeo, and, it's unique to your family. But the professionals, the court, all of us, we see it every day. And so, of course, their parents special to them. But again, their parents' behavior is usually pretty typical behavior of somebody in that situation. I certainly wouldn't want a guardian, and I don't see many people raising their hand saying, sign me up. So this is just the unfortunate progression sometimes with various diagnoses, and this is where you end up. So people shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed. We can help.
And I think we're speaking to that child or that other family member, and I want to speak to the seniors out there and people who might be in that position, just to keep in mind, and I've had so many situations like this where the kid wants to get those docs in a row to make sure that they can help in the beginning before things get really bad. And then the parent's like, I don't need you, mind your business. I don't want you in my affairs. I'm not going to sign anything. And then sometimes that hits real quick. And then next thing you know, a couple of months down the road and they're gone mentally, right? It's tough, because when I tell you I've had so many of those, if you have you ever maybe leveraged or reached out to or helped the child kind of connect with a medical, psychological professional that, maybe advice to try to help before you get to that point, and any kind of other people you bring into that mix to try? Because I had a situation myself personally where the senior was very adamant against moving. They were starting to show diminished capacity, but she knew very well what was there. But it was right at the beginning and didn't want to go anywhere, was mad at this one, was mad at that one. And then when I was working with her to sell the place in the beginning, she and I became like close, and I was able to help her, and we talked through it, and I was able to get her to understand and realize, no one's stealing your money. This is where you're at. You did forget some things, and what you're starting to, so I was kind of that person. I'd say realtors like function as psychiatrists who everyone talks to, but I was able to, be able to help her, and then she kind of opened up, and then next thing you knew, I called her a few weeks after she moved into the community, and she was too busy for me having lunch with all her friends, and she was happy as everything. But she finally agreed, and they got everything done, and it was right in the beginning, right before it becomes a problem. So that also brings up a question, like when exactly does it become a problem? How far along are you? What's the litmus test, effectively, of you have someone who now is diagnosed with dementia, but is totally coherent, knows what they're doing, knows their name, knows that they have a house, knows how much it's worth, knows everything under the sun, knows they're selling it, right? Like, where does that line go from black and white to gray? And like, what's the court's litmus test of, when is it too late? Because at that point, when it's too late, they can't legally sign a document. They can't now no longer sign a power of attorney. Like, where does that line kind of start to cross over?
That's a really good question because, we all have the God-given right to make bad decisions, right? So is somebody making a bad decision, or are they incapacitated? Right. And so just because somebody would do something you wouldn't do doesn't mean they're incapacitated, right? I mean, is every, maybe this is an extreme example, but is every hoarder incapacitated because they have the compulsion to hoard? So it's really a case by case basis. And if the person doesn't have documents, if you're in doubt, but you think you can lay out a pretty good petition to show the court what we call a petition to determine incapacity, then you let the examining committee, which is what happens in the guardianship process. It isn't just, the lawyer files something and the judge makes this decision. In the state of Florida, if you think somebody's incapacitated, the court's actually going to appoint 3 people to go and examine the individual and report back to the court. So best case scenario, I guess, would be the way to phrase it. The person's not incapacitated, and maybe they do just make poor decisions. And then worst case scenario, they are incapacitated, they don't have documents, and you continue down the guardianship road. I don't know what, Jill, how you would answer that question.
Very similar to how you do it. There is no fine line. There's a line that Michelle and I will ask a whole bunch of questions. And based on those questions, we will say, it sounds like they might be incapacitated, or it sounds like they're not. We're not the doctors. And as Michelle said, there's a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and a social worker generally. Sometimes it's a little different. That's the examining committee members that are appointed to go out. Those 3 people make the decisions, not us. If 2 of 3 of them find, and there's limited and plenary, which we won't get into today, there's a few different types, but if they find that you're incapacitated, then they go on to the guardianship procedure and have a guardianship appointed. So at that point, that's when the court determines that there is an incapacity. But I know Michelle and I have both had clients who have been determined with dementia who are perfectly capable, and in fact, more capable than some other people that I know. So just because, a lot of people will call it, but my mother has dementia. Okay, well, that's great. That doesn't mean your mother's incapacitated, number 1. And as Michelle said, number 2, bad decisions don't a guardianship make. People are allowed to make bad decisions. That doesn't mean they need to be in a guardianship. And if they're giving money to people who you don't like, that doesn't mean that you need to have a guardianship. Now, if people are stealing from them and people are coercing them, that's a totally different story. But if they're making decisions on their own, that's not guardianship material.
I have a real life example type of situation. You're a real estate agent. You have a listing and you're meeting with Greta and she's wanting to sell her property. She knows who she is. We're talking. I have no concern that there's any memory loss or any incapacity. And listing agreement is signed, and this is not an actual example, but it was potentially one actually. And then, over time, you're in a position where, it doesn't sell, it's a condo, takes a really long time. And you start seeing as a professional some things that are concerning, like your client doesn't even know who you are as their realtor. And you called them and they don't remember who you are. And for the conversation you had, they had no lucidity. They had no idea that you were selling the house anymore. And you start seeing that, right? So now, if you did go under contract, you're going to get a contract. Like, where is it valid? That person has these moments, right? So what would you recommend in that case? I mean, I've partnered with attorneys, I've spoken, and we because you also can't necessarily say, oh, I know they're losing their mind. But if someone doesn't remember who I am in that process, that's a problem. And then, so I guess my question more originally was more of like, where does that line stop? Because if someone has that memory loss and then they're signing that day of closing, and that's a moment of a day where they were lucid and they knew what they were doing, but then they show up at the closing table and they don't know why they're there. So I don't know if that's like necessarily a question, but like, how does one address that? Because that's definitely something in my world that has come up. And there's situations where I'm like, hey, we need to talk to the daughter was involved. Like they don't remember me. Like I can't, as a professional, I'm selling your house and they're not remembering they're selling our house. That kind of gets concerning on our end as well. So, we've had people that have gone to the title table that didn't know what they were doing because they have those moments, right? So where does that become a concern from the standpoint of selling real estate, and where I guess it's hard to say, like where does the line get drawn where they are able to sign that day that they're lucid and they say, yes, my name is Joe Schmo. I know I'm selling my house, and the title person's asking those questions. And where does it kind of cross over to that point where it could be challenged later that it was not properly signed because that person said they had dementia, right? Like, and there's kids involved sometimes and people just want to like push things through. So, what would you have to say about that? Like, because that happens a lot if you're working with people. And I've seen progressions of clients that have started to get worse very quickly. You have an 8-month listing, and by like 7 months, they're in really bad shape. So then now we have a situation where they didn't have the proper docs and they can't physically sign, so they're calling you for guardianship.
Well, there's a couple of things that could be done with that. I mean, number one, a guardianship, because if you know, first of all, if there's no kids, there's nobody, and it's a widow and she signed it and you were good with it when she signed, you're probably going to be okay. If there are kids involved, then what you want to do is you want to look. And when she first signed the contract, if she was competent, terrific. If she has lucid moments and she could sign the contract and she's lucid and you ask her the questions and she can answer them, then that's fine. However, if she can answer them at that point, then you're going to need to get some type of guardianship, an emergency temporary guardianship, or some type of guardianship. However, one of the ways that you can avoid this is to have her sign a limited durable power of attorney at the very beginning if you believe that there's some type of problem. And limited would allow somebody to act on her behalf to complete that particular transaction. And those are allowed in Florida, and those are sometimes used a lot in real estate transactions. And for the most part, they work. I can't say they work 100%, but they work in a lot of instances. That is one way of not having a guardianship. Unfortunately, if they get to the point, and we've all had this, where it can't be completed, then you're going to need a full-blown guardianship. With a judge, by the way, approving the sale.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had situations where people I've worked with were in nursing homes and in very poor health and terminally, potentially ill. And we look at the deed and we'll see if it was just in their name, right? And so my broker's an attorney and I'll share that, but it's hard to be able to explain to family and stuff, hey, if your health is not in good health, I want to just make sure that you are protected and that you have the proper documents, right? So I'll come to them in that way and say, do you have the proper do you have power of attorney? Have you spoken to an attorney? Just to kind of lead people to make sure that they can get those ducks in a row without making them feel bad or get upset, because, it's not that we're levying an opinion, but you're concerned. I don't want to have you be in a situation where you're going to have a problem. So I, as someone who works very, very heavily in the senior population, have seen hundreds of situations like this. I want to be able to help. And so I'll say, okay, if you want, you don't have any docs, right? You have a deed that's literally just your name, right? And they're in a nursing home. I had a seller who passed away a day after we closed, literally. The day after we closed. And you and I had 2 sellers that passed away within a week after we closed, literally. So, at the end of the day, that's horrible. And it's not necessarily like, oh, I want the deal, I want it to close, and I can't have the deal fall apart for me. It's more like, no, if you don't have those ducks in a row in that time, then that buyer who's buying its whole life has been derailed, right? Your family now is in a probatable situation. It's a disaster. And it just kind of muddies everything up for them more so. And then now you're 4 or 5 months down the line and the market's changed, the buyer's gone, you've lost money. So for me, it's more of like, because I think of everything in advance, we've had situations like that where, we've had the attorneys, like one of you guys would, speak with them and have maybe the deed revised in a way. They had a ladybird deed. You have to keep all those things in mind. So when it comes to that last ending of it, you want to prepare and make sure you don't have those problems in advance and you do all the right planning. But I just wanted to kind of chime in about what I've seen, because that does happen a lot. And it's not about the money or the closing, and it's about making sure that the lives that are involved are not put through more hassle and fees and costs and all of that. So, what is an injunction for protection against exploitation of a vulnerable adult? Can you file on someone's behalf without a power of attorney? Speak a little bit about those.
No, and that's the problem with the injunction. The injunction's a great thing, and if you have scammers and hackers and all of these things, and not now, there's a new thing. Obviously, there's the new romance issues where people are romancing people. I just had one of those. The people, unfortunately, in their mind, believe that they're being romanced when you're 93 and the person's 29. Clearly, they're not being romanced; they're being stolen from. And this particular injunction, if it's filed correctly, can be used to get the person away from them, can be used to get money back. I actually got $500,000 back in a real estate deal for one of my clients because I was able to show the judge that money was ill-gotten, and we did it through an injunction. So the injunction helped you. The problem with the injunction is if the person doesn't agree or you don't have a power of attorney for that person, you can't file it on their behalf.
So if someone doesn't have that, you're watching your parent give money to some guy in a foreign country that, is there anything one can do?
Yes, you can file an emergency temporary guardianship, and that allows you also to file an injunction after the emergency guardianship has been filed. So if you truly believe, and I've seen it and you have too, all of us, Mom and Dad just gave $150,000 in gift cards to a scammer. Mom and Dad just went and had all of their money transferred out to some guy in Ethiopia because they were told their money's getting stolen. That's the time where you can file for an emergency that is clearly an emergency, and then you're able to also file the injunction once the emergency guardianship is filed.
So that passes the test of, like you had said, sometimes you make a bad decision and not every bad decision is guardianshipable, right? Whatever. So that would potentially put it over as more than a nominal bad decision that kind of crosses over, that gives you that, right?
Wiping out your entire savings for a grifter definitely is an emergency because you now have no money left to live and we need to get some money back so that you can eat. Definitely an emergency.
Awesome. So what would you want the viewers out there, listeners out there, to take away the biggest key point from today that they need to go do and to make sure they do or take away from our time together today?
I would say the importance of planning. We go, we speak, we do things like this, and we tell people plan, and the people that are listening or in the audience, they shake their
They
head,
shake their heads, yeah.
they know, and it goes out of their mind. But if if just one person from every time we say it would plan, that's one person that maybe avoided a bad situation. But it's take the time to plan.
And mine would be visit your parents, know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you live in a different state, call them, keep an eye on their friends, keep an eye on who's around them, and make sure that the lines of communication are open.
100%. And it is the new year. And it's always good to start the new year fresh and do the right thing. And anyone listening today, we've got two amazing attorneys on our podcast today. Write their information down, follow up. If you do not have your ducks in order, get them in order. Like Michelle said, usually we get busy. One thing I do is I throw a note in my big note thing, and I literally don't let it go. I literally don't let it be forgotten. So where can our listeners out there reach you? Michelle, if you want to share a website, and then Jill, and then guys, please make sure. This is like a passion for me, very much so. And obviously they fell into this for similar reasons too. And so, it's super, super important. So let us know where we can reach you, Michelle. And
Sure. Everything, all my contact information's on my website, michellehollister.com. Michelle has 2 L's and Hollister has 2 L's. And our phone number, and I'm located in Boca.
amazing. And Jill?
www.ginsburgschulman.com, Ginsberg, Schulman, Schulman.com. And we have offices in Fort Lauderdale and in South Boca Raton.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you, ladies, so much for dropping some gold nuggets for our listeners out there. I truly appreciate your time and expertise. You guys are wonderful. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure having you. I hope you got some golden nuggets. This is probably one of the most important calls that we will have. Keep in mind, follow up. Make sure that you get your ducks in a row and protect your family and everyone, and have a great day. And thank you guys for joining us.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Most of you aren't just listening right now. You're driving, cleaning, and even exercising. But what if you could be saving money by switching to Progressive? Drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Multitask right now. Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.